In the United States and in other countries, education policy tends to be very focused on teaching and learning and issues of accountability, right? And it doesn't actually pay very much attention to the relationships that make all of these things possible, because education is ultimately a relational endeavor. And so in the US, for example, this has led to a set of policies, particularly around high-stakes testing, accountability, that really undermines the ability of educators to form supportive relationships with students. And this is damaging to students in a number of ways, and especially problematic for secondary school students and for students who are low income and students of color, who are the students I'm particularly concerned with, because my focus is urban education. So it's these urban secondary schools that can be pretty brutal places. And policies have not, the ways that policy has been practiced, has been implemented in the United States, has really undermined the ability of educators to connect with students in a more meaningful way. So there's a ton of research in the United States and internationally on student-teacher relationships and why they matter. And generally, this work has found that they are positively associated with student achievement. So a lot of this is correlational, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But some uses panel data, which has more reason to be trusted. But anyway, so the first clear finding is that students who have strong relationships with teachers tend to have higher student achievement. So, for instance, there's a large panel study in the United States that uses data collected in the first wave on how students feel about their teachers, and then tracks their achievement over time. And it's shown that stronger relationships in the first wave predict higher student achievement. Other work that I think is really interesting shows that it can actually mediate the relationship between social class and academic outcomes, right? So, huge finding in the sociology of education literature is that class is a large determiner of student achievement, right? I mean, in the United States, going back to the Coleman report, class matters more than anything else. But there's some work that suggests that when students have strong relationships with their teachers, that actually some of that achievement gap, as they call it in the United States, can be shrunk, because the relationships with teachers can be so powerful. So that's a pretty big deal, I think. There is also work that shows that this is particularly important for students who are at risk, which is, I don't know if that's a term used in Europe, but that's a very common United States term, which is highly problematic. But anyway, there is evidence that students who are at risk of school failure or having behavior problems or dropping out, that stronger student-teacher relationships can be really supportive for those students. There's also evidence that stronger relationships with teachers is associated with less exclusionary discipline, which means you have fewer incidents of students being suspended or expelled, which is obviously and in the United States, there's really strong patterns of racialized discipline, right? So African American students are much more likely to be suspended or expelled, which means they're obviously losing out on important instructional time, academic learning. So in schools where there are positive relationships with teachers and adults, those kinds of practices are less common. So that's really important, because that means kids are able to learn, be in school. They're also associated with higher self-esteem, more attachment to schooling. And there's an interesting study in Italy that looked at how student-teacher relationships was associated with how students respond to bullying. So in schools where students felt more connected to teachers, they were also more likely to intervene in an instance of bullying. Whereas students who felt less connected were more likely to kind of just stand by and watch the students being bullied. School climate is another kind of organizational feature that is amenable to change. And with that, the school leader is really key. So everyone who has spent time in schools, I'm sure has had the experience of walking to a school where the school leader is disengaged, maybe hostile, and you can feel it almost immediately in the school. School leaders who are really kind of modeling this idea of role breadth and an investment in students' overall well-being tend to create a more positive school climate. You know, there's nothing like earth-shattering about that. It's fairly obvious, but that's a really important thing that school leaders do. Another piece I didn't put in the slide is when school leaders create lots of opportunities for extracurricular activities with students, that tends to be something very positive for students. So, because again, if it's when students are able to connect with adults, not simply around academics, but around other interests in their lives, that tends to allow them to feel more connected with school. So leaders who make that possible.